With us today is Heidi, Chuck, and Angela. Welcome, and you're on.
So my name is Heidi Kraffel, and I am with the Environmental Health Epidemiology Bureau with the New Mexico Department of Health. My background is I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and I head up the Environmental Health Epidemiology Bureau. And the New Mexico Department of Health was asked by your board if we would please come and answer some questions about radiation and health. I don't have a handout of this presentation, but I would be happy to make it available afterwards. I just know that it's a little bit easier for me to interact with everybody. I tend to, when I get handouts, I look like this and I forget. So I try to trick people a little bit into paying attention. So, and I do have some handouts that could go in tandem to this presentation that I'll hand out. So I hope that I've covered what everybody wanted to. We'll see as we go through the presentation. I'm going to go through basics of radiation and health, and some of you may already know this. Some of you may know it better than me. And then at the very end, my colleagues Chuck and Angela from the New Mexico Tumor Registry are actually going to talk about cancer data in northern New Mexico. So I'm hoping that that'll be a good tie-in. And I'm going to use a very old school pointer here. So no electronics, just the pointer. So, I should point out that my colleague Barbara Toth, who's also in the Environmental Health Epidemiology Bureau, she contributed significantly to this presentation. She's a toxicologist, and I wanted to make sure I acknowledge her. Okay, so this is what I plan on covering. Just types of radiation very generally. What is ionizing radiation? How does exposure occur? What are some of the biological effects of ionizing radiation? How is dose calculated, and some of the health effects of ionizing radiation, so both non-cancer as well as cancer. So, of course, ionizing radiation is the focus of this presentation, and I will abbreviate it as IR in the presentation, just so you know. So then there's non-ionizing radiation, and so that includes everything from microwaves to visible light to lasers. And then, of course, what's ionizing radiation? So ionizing radiation is energy that can essentially eject electrons from a molecule, producing ions. And then the difference between that and non-ionizing radiation is that the non-ionizing radiation produces energy primarily in the form that's dissipated by heat. So the primary particles that I'm going to talk about are alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. And this diagram right here, hopefully people in the back can see. So alpha particles are stopped by paper, whereas beta particles are stopped by aluminum, and then lead stops most gamma rays. So what are some of the sources of ionizing radiation? You can see that there's a bunch of different sources, from cosmic rays coming from outer space to radon to land contamination, diet, the things that people eat, to plants and animals, medical use, emissions from, say, coal-fired power plants. And then, of course, you also have fallout, weapons testing, and nuclear accidents. So that's like kind of the whole gamut of particular sources of ionizing radiation. But what's really interesting is that the majority, so you see the biggest part of the pie here, 81% of ionizing radiation actually comes from natural background. So that includes the rocks, the soil, sun, outer space, and also elevation. So that's the majority of where we're getting ionizing radiation. So we're getting exposed to ionizing radiation right now. Then you have a much smaller percentage for medical. So that could be x-rays, thyroid scans, things like that. Consumer products, so in your TV or your smoke detector. And then the smallest percentage is 1%, that's from nuclear power fallout. And so next, I just want to talk about how exposure to ionizing radiation can occur. And it's the broad two categories are external or internal. And how many people here have ever gotten an X-ray? Okay, yeah, right. So that's the most obvious example of an external source is an X-ray. So an internal source is a little bit different. So that's when you're actually ingesting material that's contaminated with a radioisotope, or you're inhaling it, and then also some dermal exposure. And there's two main differences between the internal and the external exposure. So with the external exposure, and just using, again, the X-ray, say like my hand was X-rayed, once the X-ray was removed from the hand, then there's no more radiation that's being received by the tissue. It's gone. However, if you ingest something that has a radioisotope, because of biological processes and metabolism, you can actually be exposed to radiation for a longer period of time. It can distribute in the body in various different places, and so you can have longer exposure. So with the external, it's fairly cut and dry. Once the radiation is away from the body, then you're not getting the radiation there. And then these are just examples of external sources. So I've already mentioned the X-ray, and then the top there, that's a picture of someone getting radiotherapy. So that could be for cervical cancer or for breast cancer. And then the bottom is a picture of someone who works a nuclear reactor, so that they could get exposure to ionizing radiation there. And then the lower right-hand corner is the Chernobyl accident. So people in the area of the Chernobyl accident could have gotten and did get exposure there, as well as the workers who came to clean up. They would be getting external exposure to ionizing radiation there. And then as far as internal sources of exposure to radiation, these are just two medical examples. So on the left, you have thyroid cancer. So they actually have the radioactive material seeded in needles or seeds or wires, and they put it right into the tumor or next to the tumor. And then, and that's to address thyroid cancer. And I know that Chuck is going to be talking about thyroid cancer a little bit later. And then another example is polycythemia vera, which is a rare blood disease where your body makes too many red blood cells and you can get bleeding and be very tired and dizzy. And that's actually treated with radioactive phosphorus. So there's different applications to using ionizing radiation. Okay, so now I want to talk about biological effects of exposure to ionizing radiation. And you're probably going to hear me say a lot, well, it depends on this and it depends on that. It's really not that cut and dried. So it's based on a lot of different factors. So, but ionizing radiation, the biological effects can happen in a couple ways. Directly, so it can directly, here's a picture of the DNA. It can directly hit the DNA and damage it, or indirectly it can hit a water molecule, for example, have a free radical, and then affect DNA that way. But they depend not only on the total absorbed dose, but also the density of the ionization. So if it's less dense, and if it's a lower dose, then you would have less damage. And of course, DNA is always getting assaulted by different things, and there's repair mechanisms in place. So on the left here, this is just kind of like a timeline of potential scenarios. So this is not always, these are just potential scenarios. So let's say ionizing radiation, within seconds of hitting human, you can have radiation damage, DNA strand breaks, oxidative damage. Again, it depends on what the dose is, how strong it is. Then in minutes, you will have some kind of response at the cellular level. So you can have changes in gene expression, how they produce proteins or don't produce proteins, and then you can have protein modification. And then within hours, then you can have cell death. So if the damage is large enough, then the cell will die. And that can lead to acute syndromes or to organ failure. It can also lead to genomic instability. So that means there's damage to the cell, it's passed on to another cell, and basically there's problems because the cell is not replicated as it should be, so that causes a problem with the body. However, you can also have in here, depending on the dose, you can have the cell be repaired, and the cell's fine, and the person goes on normally. And then ultimately, you can get different outcomes. So cancer, birth defects, gene pool. But again, it depends on, was the DNA effectively repaired, or was it inadequately repaired? Yeah. So let's see here. So let's talk about alpha radiation biological effects. So again, alpha particles are the ones that can be stopped by paper. So first blush, that seems like, well, must not be too bad if you can stop by paper. It's not an external radiation hazard because it doesn't penetrate into the body, it's just on the skin. The problem really with alpha particles is that once they're inside the body, then they can become a health hazard because, as I said again, when you have an internal exposure, then you can have a longer duration of having the various organs and tissues exposed. Okay, so then when we talk about X and gamma radiation, they can generally penetrate sensitive organs of the body, so they can get in. And then the beta radiation, it can penetrate to about 10 milliliters in the tissue, and it can go in the external as well as internal. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about measuring dose and what some of the basic terms are, because that'll help us as we go forward here. So the absorbed dose talks about just the energy that's deposited in a kilogram of a substance by the radiation. No other reference, so that's just how much is absorbed. But the equivalent dose is actually this absorbed dose, but it's weighted for the harmful effects of different radiations. And then finally, the effective dose, you then take this equivalent dose, and then you weight it for susceptibility to harm of different tissues. Because, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, some tissues are more susceptible to harm than others. So you weight it to reflect that. So for example, with beta and gamma radiation, the absorbed dose is the same as the equivalent dose. That's because the weighting factor is only 1 for these two, for beta and for gamma. So those are equivalent. But for alpha radiation, which again is going to be more harmful inside, this equivalent dose is actually 20 times the absorbed dose because the weighting factor is 20. So you end up getting a higher equivalent dose for the alpha than you would for the beta and the gamma. So then here's the tissuating factors. So essentially what this says is that if you had the same radiation to gonads, so the testes or the ovaries, as you did to the skin, you would have a higher effective dose to the gonads than you would to the skin. It's a more sensitive organ. I want to talk a little bit about approximate doses of ionizing radiation to individuals. So on average, the annual dose to a person in the US is about 360 millirems or 3.6 millisieverts. But an individual's dose depends on a lot of different factors. So for example, from Los Angeles to New York round trip is 2.5 millirems per person. So obviously, if you're somebody who does that trip 10 times a year, then you have 10 times 2.5, you've got, 250 millirems for just for those flights, because you're closer to the cosmic radiation, the ionizing radiation there, so you would end up having a higher dose. And it also is highly dependent on where you live. So if you live at sea level, so this is supposed to be sea level here, hopefully people in the back can somewhat see the water and cliffs there. So if you live at sea level, then you're getting about 26 millirems per year. But if you live at 6,000 to 7,000 feet elevation, then you're going to get 26, so the one from the sea level, but also plus 40. So you're getting an additional amount of ionizing radiation just by being at a higher elevation. And then, of course, you add into this how many medical procedures you might have in a given year, and then you start to add more. Okay, so what happens in the body once you get a radiation dose? So ionizing radiation through the body results in deposition within some kind of tissue. So it depends on where the radiation is. Is it the foot? Is it the leg? Is it the arm? And then, but any kind of radiation energy, how much deposit is depend on the length of time that they're radiated. Obviously, when you get your hand X-rayed, it's they X-ray it for however many seconds, and then that's it. It's not. They don't have the X-ray machine over your hand for 24 hours. And then the strength of the source, how intense is that source, and the physical nature of the radiation. Is it an X-ray? Is it a gamma ray? Is it an alpha, beta? And then also distance to the radiation source. So if you were 3 miles away from the radiation source, then your deposited dose is going to be much, much lower than if it's from me to Mr. Worth here. So those are some of the factors, and keep those in mind as we talk about these here. So for immolation, so if you're breathing in radioactive gases such as radon or tritium or vapors, they can enter into the body that way through the lungs. And then it can also, radionuclides can be ingested in food and drink. So for example, milk that's contaminated, if you ingested it, that would go into your body. and they're absorbed mainly from the small intestine. And then there also dermal absorption, it can be through intact skin or through wounds. So those are the routes that they get into the body. And then this is the biodistribution of elements in human adults. I have two tables. This is just kind of a broad sense of how different it can be. So you have this, it's called half-time. So the far right-hand column here, half-time is different than half-life. So half-time is the time it takes for the element to leave the body, whereas that's different from the physical half-life, which is the time it takes the element to decay. So you would have, for example, tritium in the body would have similar concentrations in all tissues, so it kind of goes everywhere. But it only stays in the body 10 days. Whereas, let's see here, now you have strontium. So it's primarily going to go into the skeleton, although 25% of it goes into the blood. It's going to take over 20 years to leave the body. So that stays there a lot longer. And then iodine, it goes into the thyroid, but then 30% of it goes to the blood, but there's some differences, 5 to 55%. And then that only takes 80 days. So there's really a lot of differences depending on the radionuclide. And then again, this is some more just to give you an idea of, radon leaves fairly quickly, uranium 20 years, polonium 50 days. And of course, again, it depends on how much you're being exposed to, what the route is, and also the other factor is how much is actually leaving the body. So there's going to be some that leaves the body through exhalation, and then there's going to be some that's excreted in urine, feces, sweat, saliva, and then potentially in milk as well. So then what are the health effects from exposure to, or from ionizing radiation exposure? So the really acute effects, so those are very, very high amounts. Keep in mind that, high amounts. That you could have skin burns, cataracts, hair loss, birth defects, cancer, teratogenic, that's essentially birth defects such as mental retardation, damage to blood-forming organs, and then very high doses. So this is at like 500 rems. That can cause death in many, but not in all individuals, depending on the degree of medical intervention. And then long-term effects, genetic mutation, so that's when it's actually passed on, so from father and mother to the child. But that's really only been seen in animals, not in humans. And then, of course, cancers. And I do have some handouts here. There's some on acute radiation syndrome, and then there's also a couple of tables about radioactive properties of selected transuranic radionuclides, and then the cancer risk. So I'll pass, hopefully I have enough, I'll pass some here, and I'll pass some here. Thanks. Okay. So with respect to acute radiation syndrome, and again, very high doses, so 1 to 2 grays or 100 to 200 rads, the first week is kind of of exposure. If you had this type of exposure, it would be a prodrome. So that would just mean basic symptoms. Then there would be a latency period where there wouldn't be as many symptoms. And then you'd actually have manifest illness here. And then if there wasn't any kind of medical intervention, then there's a possibility of death. And the main effects from the acute radiation syndrome is hematopoietic, so it's the blood. It's affecting the blood. Then you have some gastrointestinal or some neurovascular. And so what are the cancers associated with ionizing radiation exposure? Basically, all types of ionizing radiation can potentially cause cancer in humans. But there's quite a bit of literature out there on where's the biggest evidence with the cancers, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is just another schematic. You remember at the beginning when I talked about the biological effects and essentially how ionizing radiation can affect DNA? So this is just kind of a continuation. Again, this is a possible path, but it's not a 100% this is going to happen path. There's lots of other factors. So you have cell irradiation. you have DNA damage, and then you can have some chromosomal changes, which can then end up as genetic changes, so passing those on to making copies of those cells, which can then eventually get to be a tumor. Then there's some epigenetic factors, which are some exposure factors that can also lead to a tumor. But again, then you can also have repair in here, and so you can not lead to a tumor. So what are the cancers associated with X and gamma rays? So there's sufficient evidence in humans for salivary gland, esophagus, and I've listed all of these. And so the sufficient evidence is basically the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC. They looked at all the scientific literature and said, is there enough of a relationship there in the literature you can say that there would be a causal association? There's enough evidence there. And if there is, then they call it sufficient evidence. So those all have sufficient evidence of an association there. But there's limited evidence in humans for liver, pancreas, ovary, prostate, and multiple myeloma. So they really can't say that there's enough that there would be a causal. It's kind of one of those things where it's, well, there might be some there, but it's really not strong enough for us to say that there's sufficient evidence. So with the alpha emitters, radon 222, there's sufficient evidence in humans for lung cancer. That's pretty well established. 224, bone sarcomas. 226, bone sarcomas. And 228, also bone sarcomas. And then again, these are also alpha emitters. So thorium 232, you have sufficient evidence for primary liver cancer, leukemia, but not really strong enough evidence for cancer of the pancreas and prostate. There's some evidence there, but it's not as strong as the others. Plutonium 239, lung, liver, and bone. And then underground hematite mining, there's sufficient evidence for bone sarcomas. And then for the beta emitters, so some of the short-lived isotopes of iodine, so the iodine-131, exposure during childhood and adolescence, there's sufficient evidence in humans for thyroid cancer, but not as strong evidence for iodine-131 and cancer of the digestive tract and salivary gland, as well as leukemia and bone and soft tissue sarcoma. So for strontium, you have solid cancers, leukemia, and tritium has inadequate evidence in humans, so there's really not very much there for tritium. So those are just some examples, and it's not an exhaustive list. Cesium-137, inadequate evidence in humans for cancers, but they do have it in experimental animals, so sometimes there's an extrapolation and sometimes not. So what about the hereditary effects? So ionizing radiation can produce mutations in the DNA, and then it can happen in harmful in subsequent generations. So before I was talking about damage to a cell and then a cell replicates. This is actually talking about the father and mother and then passing it on to a child. But they really only have that evidence in animals, actually. There's not a lot of evidence in humans there. So, for example, you see the second bullet, a statistically significant excess of these types of effects of passing it on to the next generation has not been shown in irradiated human populations. So the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, even though they were irradiated when they had children, it was not shown that that was passed on to their children. Now, I should say that if there was a child in utero who had been exposed, that's different. But saying that the child wasn't exposed, then the child hadn't even been conceived yet, you still had the sperm and the egg and they hadn't come together, then that's a different thing. And then there's an EPA model that suggests that there's actually a low risk of genetic diseases compared to cancer risk at very low doses of radiation, like 1 milligray or 0.001 gray to parents prior to conception. So the genetic risk is actually lower than the cancer risk there. And then there's some associations with cardiovascular disease at higher levels, so 500 rads or over 5 grays, then cardiovascular disease has been established, but really it hasn't been associated at very low doses. And then other potential associations are with cataracts. And some cataracts can be formed even at lower exposures, but that's evidence there at higher. And then I was also asked to talk about beryllium, so I'm going to talk about that really quickly, and then Chuck will talk to you. So beryllium is found in the natural environment, kind of like uranium. And so you can find it in many places, and it's very light, like aluminum, but it's very strong, just 40% more rigid than steel. And so it ends up being used in automobiles, computers, and of course also nuclear weapons, aircraft, X-ray machines, and mirrors. And so how the population gets exposed to beryllium is, once it's in the atmosphere, it can be inhaled, combustion of coal and fuel oil. And it's actually in fruit juices and rice, lettuce, potatoes, because of course it's taken up from the soil in varying amounts. And then in water, the concentration ranges from 0.01 to 1.22. That's just what the literature has shown. And it can also be in cigarette smoke. And of course, the primary concern about exposure is in occupational setting. That's where the highest concentrations can occur. And so that can be in specialty metallurgy workers, nuclear industry, et cetera. And for beryllium, there's some skin contact issues. People can get dermatitis or some skin lesions. The main concern is beryllium sensitization, or berylliosis, or chronic beryllium disease. And I want to say, let me look at my notes here because I don't remember the number. I believe it's about 5%. Let's see here. 2 to 16% of workers may develop chronic beryllium disease. And then there's sufficient evidence in humans of cancer of the lung. So obviously it's very important for worker safety, for worker health, to have adequate protections from beryllium exposure. So that is the end of my slide, or my slides rather. And so what we can do is I can attempt to field your questions now, or we can have Chuck come up, Chuck and Angela. I don't know, are you guys both coming up? Just Chuck, okay. Or you guys can listen to Chuck talk to you about some of the cancer data in northern New Mexico, and then we can kind of field questions together. So what's your preference?